All right. So another video. This time around, it will be on end of Cold War. Right. I want to say like shout out to my fans, but let's all be real. You guys are just people panicking over the exams at the very last minute. Okay. So for end of Cold War, I'm gonna jump straight onto this particular bit here, which is our decline of USSR in the 1970s, 1980s. Okay, so meaning I'm going to bypass the ton. I don't know whether I'll do that in a video some other time or I will just bypass it if no one is actually asking anything about it. The reason for this is pretty much right, relating to what are the bigger chunks of content that we probably need to be more confident and competent in. So the decline of Soviet Union in 1970s and 1980s, we would see as really one of the more common topics being asked in exams. All right, you have questions, okay, whereby they possibly introduce a given factor and ask you to agree or disagree whether that factor was the most important factor. So perhaps a question along the lines of, what was aging leadership the most important factor in contributing to Soviet economic decline or Soviet weaknesses in the 1970s and 80s, something to that effect, right? So first off, so that's how you should understand the content for this part, at least, that we are trying to understand what were the reasons why Soviet Union experienced a sharp pointed decline of experienced that decline in the 1970s and 80s. Okay, so before we can understand the decline, just a few things to take note with regards to what was the economy like prior to the 1970s. And for prior to the 1970s, for Soviet Union, right, the Soviet command economy, right? So the command economy is the system that they have, right, whereby everything is centralized under the Gauss plan, and really the Soviet economy was controlled by a committee that makes decisions for pretty much all the economic decisions of that country. So what you have would be that they will be controlling movement of resources, controlling prices, controlling wages of workers, right? And this is done, and it was rather successful in 1950s and 60s. I think post-war, Soviet Union is blessed with abundance, or was blessed with abundance of resources. So they did experience that economic growth in the 50s and 60s, and they were able to provide good healthcare, place to housing for the people, free education up to university level. And these were the promises made by, promises offered by a communist system. Right. However, the good times did not last. The impressive growth in the 50s and 60s eventually paved the way for a sharp decline in the industrial production by the late 1970s. That was why also Soviet Union was a lot more interested to actually have that detente with America so that they can slow down the competition, they can look for opportunities to conduct some form of trade. And by about 1970s, output growth for Soviet agriculture had dropped right, to about 2% per year, right? So the growth used to be about 5% and it dropped to 2%. So technically it was still growing, but at that slower pace, and eventually that could eventually lead to a drop in production. So all in all, this actually spelled that, or this actually revealed that the Soviet Union or the Soviet economy, the economy wasn't performing well, and therefore we need to understand by the 1970s what was wrong with the Soviet economy. And the first factor that we're going to be looking at would be the weaknesses of the Soviet economy, and we have 4 here. So every one of them does help you to understand why is it that it was a big problem. First off, you have the Soviet economy. I mean, we didn't learn about Stalin's 5-year plans, but the 5-year plans were very there was tremendous growth at that point of time because you were looking at a very a lot more straightforward economy focused on steel, coal, electricity, right? As Soviet Union grew, the demands of the people grew, the economy became more complex, and you had many smaller industries, more and more decisions needed to be made, and generally the command economy, whereby everything is centrally planned, does bear a lot of weaknesses because you would be paralyzed by the many decisions you would have to make, right? So I'm going to put some details here. Perhaps, overwhelmed by increasingly complex needs of country, right? So increasingly complex economic needs of the country. They struggled to cope with making many different goods, right, for their population, and as such, they oftentimes acted too slowly, right? Acted too slowly and made poor decisions. I always try to help students understand by giving the analogy of of for example, if you would have the Ministry of Education plan, and you have like maybe 20 people in that committee plan all the lessons for all the schools in Singapore, right? And then they shuffle teachers about, they make decisions whereby, okay, they don't look at how what you were qualified in. You are qualified in history, but you are posted to a school and you are teaching math, and they said that doesn't matter. All right, so the allocation of resources were terrible. The people in the job couldn't make decisions, so therefore that's why we say the decisions were always very slow, because it all came from one person, right? Or one committee, the Gauss plan, right? That's overstretch. Right, so that settles the structural weaknesses of the command economy, and you can try and understand how this would actually cause the command economy to be very, to find it hard to make very dynamic decisions, right? So next up, the external burdens of the economy. So at a time whereby you realize that you are struggling economically, you're not producing at the level that is expected of a superpower, but you still want to play that role of a superpower. So you're still involved in proxy wars, all right? Their involvement in the Vietnam War, the Angolan Civil War, all right? And of course, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, all right? What the Americans called the Soviet Union's Vietnam, all right? So really a war that not only complicated their position in international standing, but at the same time, it was a war that strategically, economically was not a very sound decision, right? Afghanistan is quite an unconquerable country. The British found that out. Recently, America also understands the complexity in taking over a country like Afghanistan. So for us in this context, the idea is very simple. The war, you only remember the examples. This war simply burned a hole in their pocket, and there were too many holes in their pockets already. So really, it was something that they could not actually cope with. Right? Of course, they were making these decisions because of the Cold War. Right? Nonetheless, it was something that they could not really. They don't have the finances for it. Okay, so that's external burdens of the economy. Next up, the poor standard of living for the people in Soviet Union. So if your economy is struggling, images of what we saw from that time would be the long queues. Became a very common thing in Soviet Union. I shared with you that according to you guys, the unfunny joke about how Gagarin, all right, he leaves for work and he goes on a space shuttle, comes back home, and the wife left at the same time, but the wife is still stuck in a queue, right, waiting to buy bread, right? Even the famous cosmonaut Gagarin, his wife family doesn't have enough food to eat. So really that so-called that's Russian humor, but at the same time it also tells us the quality of life for the people, right? So Americans would be enjoying cars, TVs, washing machines, and yeah, to the Soviet Union this was impossible. All right, I think people like Yeltsin, uh, who had traveled. I mean, this is later on. He marveled at a supermarket. He was obsessed with the supermarket when he actually went to uh, to America. All right, it was just a normal American state, and looking at the produce they had, he recognized the failures of the command economy. All right. Furthermore, they had prioritized military spending above everything else. All right, prioritize prioritize their communist ideology, whereby the wages were not increasing. Right, imagine working harder every year, and then you are still receiving the same amount of pay. It will be very frustrating. Okay, long queues in supermarket. All right. Okay, we see pictures of empty shelves. These were common all over Soviet Union. Okay, next, the disillusionment of the workforce. And I think the arrows work this way, but you could easily recognize how the structural weaknesses of the command economy contributes to a poor standard of living, and then you have a very disillusioned workforce as well. All right, if you are not sufficiently compensated, you will grow frustrated no matter how in love you are with the communist ideology. All right, it will come to a point whereby you will be frustrated. All right, okay, but other aspects of the disillusionment, of course, the corruption of the system, right? And the corruption is deeply embedded already. Bosses appointed based on bribes or personal connections. So a lot of nepotism. Okay, the fear of the secret police. Yeah. So at this point of time, I think they would have been called the KGB already. Yeah. So generally, discontentment, disillusionment, it means they're also not going to be working very hard in the command economy. They're not going to be putting their best. They're not going to be innovative because they are frustrated at the entire system, right? And of course, they are going to find out about this later on. So next up would be a different, slightly different factor, all right? Opposition to communism in Eastern Europe, all right? Here, so what you probably would need to know is that the Soviet establishment of the satellite states and then the introduction of the Warsaw Pacts enabled the Soviet Union to have quite a firm grip of control over Eastern Europe. But there were moments in the history of some of these Eastern European countries whereby they have shown that degree of independence, right? So, right, part of Comecon and Warsaw Pact, okay, did enable USSR to control, right? And of course, the protest movements, all right? Okay, so yeah, the Comecon and Warsaw Pact enabled USSR to control, but already there was a drain on resources, all right? Providing all the subsidies, all right? Oil was super lucrative in the 1970s because of the oil crisis, but if the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union is committed to Comecon, so there will be oil subsidies given to the Warsaw Pact members, to the Comecon members, which meant that they could not really profit from the increasing prices of oil. Then we have the protest movements. Okay, you can talk about the Prague uprising and the Hungarian uprising as well. Okay, and all these yeah, I showed you the images. All this meant that there was great the willingness of people to protest and okay, the stories behind the protests are actually very interesting as to how it actually came about, whereby some of the governments of this country gave that opportunity for a bit more diversity in their political structures, and then eventually frustrations boiled over, and then subsequently the Warsaw Pact countries had to come in to quash the protesters and really quell, really crush the protests, right? So how does this lead to the decline of Soviet Union? This would mean that they would have to spend more, and this eventually crystallized into the Brezhnev doctrine, right, whereby the Soviet Union would have been okay. This is all right, whereby all okay, this a bit of the Brezhnev doctrine. All the Eastern Bloc countries would be a one party state. Right. Yeah, and that the yeah, any attempts to reverse communism, any attempts to dilute communism, yeah, the Warsaw Pact soldiers on standby to crush revolts. All right, and yeah, there were leaders who were very pleased with this. Eric Honecker of East Germany was especially pleased because this would strengthen their own authoritarian regimes. All right. So, yeah, the connection between the, sorry, I forgot to highlight this. Let's just do that. Okay. Okay, the connection between these two events are quite clear. Okay, the benefit of mind maps, you do see this quite a bit, right? So they're sort of like a package deal as well. Okay, I made it worse. And last, for this one here, you have the aging leadership of, right, of the Soviet leaders. Okay, essentially, I know I say word essentially a lot. By the 1970s, the average age of Politburo members was above 65. That's retirement age actually. And then you had the succession of leaders who passed on. Uh, Even the last few years of Brezhnev's rule, uh, okay, he was really, really sick. And yeah, was it him? Whereby the wife actually made some decisions, right? Okay, people were comparing this to America's uh, recent elections in 20 or ongoing elections, right, in 2024, where Biden and then of course Trump were both quite aging. I mean, they were very old, and then or they are very old. Yeah, and how it's not very a good representation of a dynamic country. So same goes for Soviet Union with that diminishing numbers for their yeah, these are their names. You just need to remember a few, and it's actually it does pave the way for the rise of Gorbachev. In fact, Andropov was quite a big supporter of Gorbachev. Right, but yeah, you know, when you are at that age, how responsive can you be to being the leader of the Soviet Union, involved in a Cold War with America, who we were going to mention about how they are going to experience that revitalization, right? And they are, stuck in that Soviet war in Afghanistan, and all these issues here. Therefore, the war just dragged on. There was never a good time to actually exit the war. Okay, next up you have U.S. economic and military superiority, and this comes under return to Cold War tensions. All right, so you had a detente, okay, but already by the time of Jimmy Carter presidency, there was already the end of detente, but the arrival of Reagan revitalized the Cold War with Soviet Union and revitalized America's economy as well. So Reagan took office in 1981 and took on a very confrontational approach towards Soviet Union. All right, uh, he wanted that rivalry. Okay, maybe he wanted that rivalry because it was a distraction to his domestic policies, which at that time were quite controversial. I mean, not just at that time, even until today, seen to be this economic liberalization, paving the way for what many have attributed to the increasing wealth gap in America. Okay, but that's another topic altogether. So Reagan, with his Hollywood background, all right, he loves to use this imagery of America's being the good guys, the heroes, and of course Soviet Union as the evil empire. So that to me marks very easily, USSR as an evil empire. Right, so there were a lot of political cartoons drawing the Soviet leaders as their star figures and all that. Yeah, very it would have been very interesting then. So Reagan introduced economic liberalization, into America, all right, where the government regulations should be reduced as far as possible and allow capitalism to go unhinged. Maybe that's not the best word. Capitalism to go on a free run. All right, that government regulations reduce, taxes reduced. Okay, so that people can make more profit. And at that time, his ally would have been Margaret Thatcher, and both believed in free market to solve to solve problems within society. So the government should be as as non-intrusive as possible. You can say that. So this promptly increased or greased the wheels of the American economy, brought back confidence, and Reagan played a bigger role, was in a position to play a bigger role in international politics. All right, and thus he took a very strong approach against Soviet Union, as I mentioned earlier, calling them the evil empire. All right, taking aim at their war in Afghanistan and Nicaragua. All right, so he supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. All right, yeah, I in my class I had a lot of stories for this. I don't have time for for stories now. It's supposed to be a very condensed lesson. All right, and he spent massively. I think the strategic defense initiative is something we need to be very familiar with, as if we are citing examples of how he renewed this competition. It's also called the Star Wars program. Yeah, it was one of the things that also, of course, made it very difficult for initially Reagan and Gorbachev to get along, because Gorbachev was really worried about this. The technology is not here even until today. These satellites that can shoot down Soviet or maybe today Russian missiles, the technology is still not available. Yeah, I think maybe Elon Musk has a better shot at it. Okay, so yeah, that brings us to the end of the return to Cold War tensions. I have it here as well. Yeah, maybe I forgot to delete it. All right, yeah, maybe there's no space here. So just ignore this. All right, now we look at the ascension of Gorbachev. So the question also that examiners would ask would be like, what was it that led to the ascension of Gorbachev? Was it to solve all the long-term problems of Soviet Union, or was it as a response to America's ignition of the Cold War? Right. So, and in power, all right, we're going to look at a few aspects of Glasnost, the reforms that he introduced. Okay, again, most of the time I need to look at the slides, more so because I don't want to go too far off, right, in my own little tangents. Right, so yes, Glasnost called for open debate on government policy. So Glasnost itself means openness and debate on government policies. And of course, the intent is to improve government efficiency, right? Improve on the command economy, improve all these things. Okay, he allowed back dissidents into the exiles into the country. Dissidents who were arrested were released. All right. He himself, Gorbachev, he was better traveled. He was a very cultured man. In his interactions with the world leaders, they would find out that this man is not like some brutish, thuggish KGB leader. All right, he was a cultured person who read widely, the histories of Europe. Okay, he could quote famous quotes of British prime ministers and whatnot. So somebody they recognized to be quite worldly, right? He recognized the weaknesses of the command economy. He wanted to modernize it. Some suggest that he was a Leninist, whereby the introduction of these free market reforms later we'll see to a certain extent. Right. So his new thinking, right, will be expressed in Glasnost. All right. Allowed criticisms of government. Okay, there is reduced censorship for sure. All right, you could call out officials for being corrupt. Okay, all right, and yeah, access to Western European news. All right, BBC was accessible, and this to me caused as much problem as okay, whereby you can criticize, and now you also know that you've been lied to for a very long time. So yes, the focus of the hatred was perhaps, the focus may not have been specifically Gorbachev, but of course the hatred towards the Communist Party, the anger at being lied to all this while. Okay, so perestroika, two sets of reforms. You have the economic perestroika and the political one. All right, the idea is again to rejuvenate the country, to increase efficiency, fight, fight corruption. So allowed for some market forces into the Soviet economy for the first time. The last one person to do this was Lenin. You can buy and sell for profit. All right. Okay, but yeah, the intent was there. However, okay, despite the positive intent, it did not really bring about that much success, all right? Because there's still a lot of the Soviet mechanisms or the Soviet command economy was still in place. Okay, the people had the option of doing these things, but there was no support for real real sense of really profiteering and whatnot. Okay, because there's still a lot of corruption. You want to start a business, you'll find problems here and there. You want to take loans, there'll be problems here and there. So it brought a lot of frustration in the end. All right, you still had unemployment, black market, and shortages in basic necessities. So the supermarket of Soviet Union still looked like the supermarket of the old. There was no joy, I'm somebody who likes to go to the supermarket, so I can understand why it's very frustrating if your supermarket is quite empty. Okay, so yes, that was the economic perestroika, the political perestroika. He wanted to keep the Soviet Communist Party, but at the same time, he allowed for elections. All right, called for elections, right, to form an opposition, which formed the Congress of People's Deputies. Right, he created an opposition bloc. Right, created new positions. Later, there would have been a president of the Russian Republic, position held by Yeltsin. All right. Yeah, so all this was, of course, in the spirit of perestroika, in the spirit of rejuvenating uh, a very much broken system, right? Okay, to provide more autonomy, all right, and all these things, maybe good intent, but maybe some naivety as well. And all in all, later it created problems which he could not solve. Foreign policy reforms, okay, his new thinking, all right, the new thinking is, of course, basically no more Cold War rivalry, all right, focusing on cooperation with America, right? Okay, later on we'll see this in the form of the Reagan Gorbachev summits, all right. As much as when I was doing a bit of my own little readings about this, all right, during their meetings, it wasn't always as easy as sometimes we make it out to be. It took a while for them to actually get together. All right, okay, there were journalists who mentioned that they had these fireside chats to actually have without any interpreters. And some of the anecdotal things that people mentioned, that the one thing that somehow brought them together, Gorbachev asked Reagan, what would Soviet Union do if America was attacked by aliens? I think, don't know, maybe he would just finish watching Star Wars and all that. He asked, like, what would Soviet Union do? Then Gorbachev actually said, no, Soviet Union will come in to help. Gorbachev asked the same question, and then Reagan said the same thing. And then they had a laugh, and it did bring about better relations. And this was, of course, reflected in the reduction in spending on arms, okay, the decision to withdraw, okay, the STAR Arms Reductions Treaty. Can't remember offhand. Okay, whereby they reduced a whole class of missiles, and they were talking about how in by 2060, for example, that maybe the world will be nuclear free, or at least weaponized nuclear will not be a thing. So yes, it paved the way for Soviet Union to be less entrenched, less bothered by Cold War rivalry, and could focus more on glasnost and perestroika. So that was the aim. And of course, the connection with whatever, for everything that Gorbachev asked, Reagan would ask something in return. So Reagan encouraged or persuaded Gorbachev to release the control over the Eastern European countries, which he eventually did. Okay, in a famous United Nations speech, okay, he announced the Sinatra Doctrine, all right, to essentially tell or say that Warsaw Pact will no longer be enforced. And these countries are Eastern European countries like East Germany, Poland, Hungary. They are able to decide for themselves how they want to shape their politics. So that was a landmark decision. And then we, of course, know that once that happened, the connection to collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, where you had these Eastern European countries looking on at what's happening in Soviet Union. They also want aspects of glasnost, perestroika. So when he announced that the Warsaw Pact countries would withdraw Soviet troops, and that Soviet army would no longer prop up, right? Soviet army no longer prop up communist regimes, which was costly as well. Right, there was a dramatic protest movement within a matter of 2 years. Much of Eastern Europe, the political landscape changed completely and forever. Okay, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Many stories about that as well. Right, and ultimately, the movements, right, people like Wallace union movements, the solidarity movements in Poland, different movements to really topple the communist leaders. All right, some peacefully, in many instances not so peacefully. In Romania, for example, it wasn't a peaceful transition. And while all these things were happening, all right, Gorbachev and this was happening in the Eastern European countries. Within the Soviet Union itself, there were republics declaring themselves to be independent. All right, Lithuania, Azerbaijan, all these republics were demanding for independence. So Soviet Union, the Communist Party, was trying to find a new framework to see how you could still keep the republic together, the 15 republic together, but at the same time provide more autonomy. How will it look like? And Gorbachev, of course, realizing that, okay, this is 1991 already, realizing that things are moving in different directions, and that he was pretty much losing quite a lot of control. And he decides to go for a 2-week holiday, right, in the Crimean Sea. So at this point of time, with the republics like Lithuania and Azerbaijan declaring independence, okay, the communist hardliners organize a coup to replace Gorbachev, right? They form a committee to run Soviet Communist Party to deal with the emergency situation of all these republics declaring themselves to be independent. And ultimately, this led to a protest movement led by Yeltsin, right? And where he marched to the White Palace. Okay, basically he marched against the Soviet Communist Party, at least the committee, and demanded that they resign. The military that was sent in to deal with the problem, right? And Yeltsin took a big risk by standing in the way with the protesters, and eventually the tanks did not shoot down the protesters. In a way, Gorbachev was saved by Yeltsin. Gorbachev returns, all right, but recognize that real power was with Yeltsin already, who demanded that Gorbachev sign in, force, coerce Gorbachev to dissolve the Soviet Union. There were talks to have a Commonwealth of independent republics, and where they will still coordinate and whatnot, but that wasn't the priority at that point of time. By then, Gorbachev had no real power. He stepped down as the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, and Yeltsin went on to lead Russia. All right. So, in having this part as well, I want students to recognize the collapse of the communism, which we also recognize as the end of the Cold War. But there were other moments in history or other moments in the 1980s where you could also recognize to be the end of the Cold War. I leave you to think through that bit. That doesn't look good. Yeah, for students to also find ways to connect the different factors. You have your mind map here to think about. All right, how does Glasnost connect with the NDs? Right, this openness. How did it play a role in this? Right, how did it play a role in the collapse of communism here? Right, Gorbachev's decision to introduce opposition into Soviet Union. How did it contribute to this? Right, you see the names here. Right, so the slight advantage of the mind map allows you to form that connections, right? And when you are looking at certain essay questions, then you have this to base to be a good starting point to make decisions as to how to tackle the question best. Right, I am done.